and see everybody. And well, I've got two hooks. One is having Guy here talking, because I've been reading about the Commons in his book, and I'm very interested in it. And so I'm going to be very interested to hear what he has to say. But to put my all in a bit at the top, since I get this slot. So I'd be very interested, Guy, how you respond to this in a way, as much as whatever else you and Tom talk about, of course. But it partly also came to me because, you know, we're nearing the end of the full-on lockdown, at least for now. And it feels to me that this is quite a crucial moment for our quest for meaning. You know, that the old ways of life are going to kind of rush back into the vacuum that the lockdowns created. And you know, in some ways with very good reason, because people are going to lose jobs and so on. But I feel it's also an important moment to try and hold on to what we've learned over recent weeks. In particular, you know, if you've been here before, you'll have heard me going on about that. I think that it's the spiritual dimension to life that we've really lost, and that strange times like we've had, at least for some, throw up because they maybe directly face suffering, but more generally, questions of meaning and so on become really important. And I think it's related to this question of the commons, actually, and also even to basic income. I mean, let me just start with the notion of the basic income, because when I was thinking about that there was a time, I stand to be corrected, but I was sort of presuming there was a time when a basic income has been tried. And essentially it's in monastic communities, which is when everybody has the same income, the same access to material goods, you know, more or less. They could be corrupted, you know, the abbot might become a bit of a monster, that kind of thing. But in principle, at least, religious societies where everyone's sharing the same income. But that was set within a wider purpose, which was, I think, to discover and then also to remind wider society of why we're here, which is this spiritual dimension, that this life serves a wider life, whether it be the lives of others, the lives of the environment, or indeed what happens after this life, the next life, that we're here, if you like, to become capable of more than just this life. So I think that that sense of really not just some sort of personal meaning, but some really big vision of society and life and what it was about, feels to me to be really important when it comes to situating a basic income. And you know, the flip side of it is that often work does provide people with meaning. I mean, I've worked for quite a long time at the Maudsley Hospital, the mental health hospital here in South London. And, you know, work is one of the metrics that's used to help identify meaning for people. Now, it's not perfect. You know, sometimes work is, as Tom will tell us, shit jobs. There's no doubt about that. But nonetheless, there's something in that. And I think that work can become a kind of ersatz meaning when this big spiritual vision gets lost. So I'm kind of interested in that respect. The other area is in relation to the commons. And I was reading Guy's book partly for what he says, and his article in the Idler actually, partly for what he says about the loss of the commons. And it struck me that this seems to correlate in some measure with the loss of a sense of what you might call the spiritual commons. You know, so land, I think, belonged to nobody for a long time because it was felt to be entrusted by God. It was kind of part of life itself. And, you know, wealth, material wealth was seen just to be a kind of sacramental version of what you might call the wealth that's fully abundant, that's never scarce. The wealth of life itself, of love, of delight, of interest. You know, Einstein, I think, caught some of this in his quite well-known expression when he said, can anyone imagine Moses, Jesus, or Gandhi with the money bags of Carnegie? We kind of know that Moses, Jesus, and Gandhi were onto a wealth of a different kind that the money bags of Carnegie just distract from. So that is what you might call a kind of spiritual commons. You know, it's what makes suffering meaningful because it can open us to more. It's what's good, beautiful, and true. It's about the imagination and education in its broadest sense, not just kind of, it's not just about technology.
Oh my God, what was that?
I'm talking through it.
the occasional interruption.
Yeah. You know,
trying to set up there.
Therapist, and you know, often healing in psychotherapy happens when people start taking imagination and inner life, these things which a very material age more or less discounts. When people start taking imagination and inner life seriously, you know, they start trusting their intuitions and don't just demand evidence all the time. It's when they start trusting relationships and friendships and don't just demand justice and rights all the time, important though that can be. So I feel the spiritual commons, you know, which is about our attention, about trusting inner things, expanding our perception in the widest possible sense, must crucially have a part to play in this. And I do wonder whether the material commons sort of loses its traction because we lose touch with the spiritual commons as well. And so we become sort of quasi-Marxists, where everything can be wrapped up into property and traded and earned and so on. Just a final thought on this, you know, we worry about climate change, and quite rightly so. But I'm really impressed by Ruskin's take on this, where he said, you know, we shouldn't worry about climate change just because it pollutes the air, but because we long to see what he called the last pure sunset, which he reckoned he'd seen in 1876. And he saw this as a painter because he says, as he puts in his famous essay, Storm Clouds, the brightest pigments would have looked dim beside the truth of this brightest sunset. So there's a kind of spiritual value to the world around us that in a way is more important because it drives our desire and our yearning. Again, it gives us this kind of biggest vision. You know, I think this is why idling matters, not just because idling is a corrective to a, you know, a hyper-working society, or that's definitely the case, but because it's only in idling that we recover this different sides of life and might have a chance of restoring it. I was listening to an interview with Eckhart Tolle during the week, you know, the very well-known spiritual writer who I think is really onto something. And he was asked in this interview, you know, what do you do for fun? What do you do for pleasure? And he said, oh, well, you know, I enjoy a glass of wine sometimes, but I like sitting in my chair. It delivers me real delight. Real idling, when we really get into it, can absolutely do that. So to come to some sort of close, you know, I'm going to be interested in what Tom and Guy say now, because these thoughts on basic income and the commons really do interest me, because I feel they're connected to these things that agitate me a lot, which might be summarized as the loss of our spiritual commons, the need for a spiritual dimension for life to make sense, that you know, can stand up against material life, can stand up against empirical demands, can stand up against everything being traded and owned, because we feel it in our hearts, if you like. We know it to be true, and we want to orientate our lives around it, as perhaps has happened in previous societies, so maybe can even happen again now. Tom.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I'm sorry to hear that you find these things agitating and you get agitated. I thought you had a more of a kind of stoic view on life and remained unruffled.
Tom, after all these weeks, you still think stoicism is about that?
Yeah, but I mean, I've never seen you get agitated, but I like the idea of you getting agitated by the lack of spiritual reality in our everyday lives. So there's something that really, really annoys me. Let's say everyone to say hello to Guy Standing, Professor Guy Standing. I'm just going to unmute you. Is he unmuted? Maybe you could have a go. Oh, there he goes. Now, Guy joins us from. Hello. Could you give us a hello?
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. No, not you.
I'm going to change completely.
Not you, Suzanne. It was Guy we were trying to find. Here we go.
I'm changing.
Although, you know, hello to you as well. Now, that's a terrible picture we got of. Oh, there. Now, Guy is in his a 14th century mill in Tuscany, and we had a couple of sound problems earlier when we were doing our sound check. So if you do hear some little beeps and things, we're aware of it. Don't send us loads of messages saying that Guy's beeping, because we know. And we'll try to sort of cope with it. Guy, are you with us?
Yeah. Can you see me?
Wow! Now we got an incredibly bad.
I'm going to leave the other one.
Oh yeah, there's two of you.
Okay.
Now we got two of you.
Yeah, Guy, we can only have one computer, I'm afraid.
Oh, there he goes. There he goes.
Yeah, we've only got one. We've got
Brilliant.
one computer.
Okay. Okay. So Guy, thank you so much for joining us. Just everyone, we know there's a little bit of a beepy noise. Oh, my microphone's too loud, isn't it? How's that? Is that better, everybody?
I can hear you.
Is my microphone too loud? Yeah. We do have a sound check, everyone, before we start, but you never know what's going to happen. In a Zoom, it's crazy. So, Guy, thank you so much for joining us. I'll give a very, very brief introduction because I know most people will have read your introduction on the blurb. You are an economist. You're affiliated to many different universities, including SOAS. You've spoken at Davos and have written many, many books. The last 3 books have come out in fairly quick succession over the last 2 or 3 years. There was Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen, which came out, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. Last year, we interviewed you at festivals for Plunder of the Commons, a manifesto for sharing public wealth, which goes right back to the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest and so on, and shows how, I think, or aims to argue that common land, common resources have been sort of more or less privatized, stolen by, greedy people. And your most recent book is called Battling 8 Giants, and it's a further manifesto on basic income. Now, these are all wonderful books. I've enjoyed every word. Everyone, please do look into them. Guys, they're very readable, but there's tons of information, but there's a very strong, they're very strong polemics at the same time, so they're good fun. And obviously there's something, it's a very serious idea because basic income is something we've been looking at the island for many, many years. I mean, I think it was quite a sort of fringy thing in the 90s. People like New Economics Foundation, Demos, I remember James Robertson and various others talking about it, and Guy, you would have been as well. And it seemed quite fringy, but it's sort of coming back into the mainstream a little bit. And I compare this moment, maybe grandly, but in 1942, William Beveridge was commissioned by the opposition party to write a proposal on a new form of a welfare state, which obviously led to things like the NHS in 1945, 1946. And they spoke about the golden age then. The end of the war is the opportunity for us to create a golden age with a new kind of social security system. And in a way that did happen, though we all remember that the 5 giants that Beveridge spoke of were want, i.e. poverty, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. And obviously we disagree with the last one of those 5. Guy, hello, thank you very much for joining us. Can you just tell us where you are, and then we can talk about the first book, Basic Income, and whether you, in fact, think that you are the new Beveridge.
Well, on the last point first, I certainly don't have any pretensions in that direction. But I'm sitting on the floor of a 14th century mill that we've been renovating for the last 25 years. And the mill stone was under this chair that I'm sitting on, and he used to grind the wheat with an ox pulling the wheel. And it's a wonderful place. It's on a stream, and you probably, the disturbance that some of you may hear may be something to do with the water flowing outside the window. We've got a 9-meter waterfall which crashes onto the rocks, so it could be that. But I think the interesting thing about basic income, and we'll come to that later, is that as you've mentioned, it goes back right to the constitutional foundations of our society on November the 6th, 1217, when the Magna Carta came into existence. Only on that day. Everybody's taught it's 1215, but actually it only became the Magna Carta in November 1217. And alongside that was the Charter of the Forest. And at the time, both were given equal status. They were both called Magna Cartas. And the importance of the Charter of the Forest was that it was the most subversive revolutionary document, if you like. And I don't think a king, had he been much older than 10, he was only 10, he watched as the marshal put his seal to it and the cardinal put the seal to it. because it was a very subversive document, and it returned large parts of the commons that had been taken by King John and by the barons and everything. It was the first time when a lot of land was restored to commons. And in the charter, it said that every free man had a right to subsistence, a right to live in the commons, and a right to access raw materials in the commons. And you can look through our history, and we've been going through endless struggles to reclaim commons that have been illegitimately taken away through the enclosure movements, through privatization, through all sorts of devious methods, island clearances, where the commons have been taken away from the commoners and been converted into the hands of a tiny minority. And it's very relevant for the discussion of a right to a basic income. We'll come back to that later. But the essence of the commons is that it's something that we all share. It's about public wealth and about commoning. And the essence of commoning is that we all have a right to share and to interact and, in a sense, work and common and idle. The essence of idleness goes back to the ancient Greeks. We've just been hearing a bit about that. And the ancient Greeks understood that the citizen did work, but not labor. That was for the slaves, the banosai, the metics. And the essence of the ancient Greek life was to recognize that work had a value, and that the essence of a citizen was to maximize their time in skole, which was leisure, but it meant public participation in the life of the polis. And Aristotle, of course, gave primacy to the importance of urgia, laziness, because he said a man, to be able to be a public citizen, must have some time for idleness. It goes through to Cato much later, who said, never is a man more active than when he's doing nothing. I think that's very true. It's only the modern mind of the last 200 years which has made the necessity of idleness into a sin. And they want people not to do work so much as labor. So the ideal for modern industrial society and service society is to have everybody in jobs except themselves. And the essence of the whole struggle through our history is to free up time so that the ordinary man and woman can spend that time in doing work that is not labor and leisure that is not just recuperation from labor. And the stupidity of the modern politicians from the beginning of the last century to this is that all work that is not labor disappears from our statistics, disappears from political rhetoric, is not recognized, is not in our national accounts. It's zero. It's not counted. And the essence of a basic income is to say that every activity, including the vital activity of care, unpaid care work, should be given equal status. We need leisure. We need to be able to do the work that is not labor. And it should not be that we tie everything, our statistics, our social protection system, to the performance of labor. And the very people who are minimizing their own labor and getting the biggest basic income of all through inherited wealth tend to be the most puritanical with regard to other people, how they use their time. And for me, this is a modern contradiction that we should be really furious about. And if every one of us is a feminist, which I hope we are, we should all be standing up and say, this pandemic is showing once and for all that we should never exclude unpaid care work, voluntary work from our valuations of activity. And we've been seeing a squeezing of leisure, a squeezing of real idleness, which we need to be political animals. And to be able to survive with resilience and deal with shocks. So for me, this is a multitude of things coming together. And the book that I produced that came out in March that you mentioned just a few minutes ago is called Battling 8 Giants. And I took what you've taken, Tom, from that 1942 report, which is on page 2. And Beveridge was hardly a radical. He was a Edwardian gentleman and, you know, very, very staid, boring character by all accounts, and was certainly no radical. But he said, this is a time for revolutions, not patching. And the challenge is to slay those 5 giants. The order you gave them, Tom, was not the same order as he gave, but that doesn't matter. But what he meant by idleness was something different from what you and I regard as idleness. We need idleness. What he was talking about was the mass unemployment, the involuntary activities for the everyday, all days, for the mass unemployed of the Great Depression. That's what he was referring to in idleness. I hope that if he were alive now and had been listening to you and Victoria and others in this group, he would be very careful and not use that word for what he had in mind.
Well, okay, yes, Guy, but when this idea...
And I think that let me just end on that point, Tom. The problem we have today is that our system is extremely fragile. Our economic system was having, an accident was waiting to happen. And the 8 modern giants, just to list them, are inequality, which is worse than ever, mass insecurity, which is worse than any time in our lifetime, debt, ditto, stress, we have a pandemic of stress, precarity, the loss of rights by a larger and larger number of people in the precariat, automation, those robots that we should be welcoming, but they're disruptive because of our economic system. And the biggest threat of all is extinction. And I happen to think that the extinction means we're under threat ourselves. And the final one is neo-fascist populism. So those are the modern 8 giants. And the basic income was not a panacea, but it can address and reduce the power and threat of those giants. So that's the theme of the book.
Now, to me, these ideas seem eminently sensible. You know, the point about paying for the unpaid work that goes on in every household is obviously absolutely right, and the basic income could immediately address that. Now, the objections to the basic income that we see are generally 2, I think. I mean, to give an example, I sent out an email about this event to our mailing list today, and I had a reply from a friend of mine who is a Tory MP called Rebecca Harris, and she's a very brilliant MP for a place called Castle Point, which is in East England. And, you know, it's a very sort of working class community. It's almost UKIP-y, but she's been the MP there for 10 years. I wrote this note and explained, you know, what basic income was all about, why I thought it was a brilliant idea, because it would give a sort of foundation. It would remove poverty, essentially. You know, it's poverty that makes people suffer and struggle and, you know, insecure. And with this basic income, as you've argued, you know, people can flourish in their lives because that basic worry has been taken away of eating, you know, essentially, and shelter, food and shelter. And I just got a 1-word reply from her: no. And you know, she's a Tory MP. There's a Tory MP, Nick Bowles, who famously wrote. Well, I don't think he's a Tory MP anymore, but he famously about 3 years ago. So this basic income thing, you know, us Tories object to it on moral grounds. It's morally wrong to pay people to sit around doing nothing. All they'll do is tend to their gardens, write poetry, and play music. And I'm like, but they're good things. The other objection is, well, how are we going to afford this? So how do you address those 2 objections, which you must have heard a million times, Guy, over the last 2 or 3 decades over which you've been promoting this brilliant idea?
Yeah, well, it's based on prejudice. That's first and foremost. If everybody, imagine a situation where every one of us as individuals had a modest basic income guaranteed as an economic right, a couple of £100, say, just to give a picture. I'm not saying that is my recommendation, but just imagine it. And we had it as a right, and we were told that we could do whatever we wish within the law beyond that. First thing that comes across is when all people are asked that question, if you had that, would you stop working? And 95, 97% consistently, according to polls in many countries, say, no, I would not stop work. I still would want to improve my life. And that's the normal human condition. You are not paying people to sit around doing nothing. You are paying to give them the security, the confidence, and the opportunity to go and make something of their life. Now, we've done pilots. I've been involved in many pilots around the world, where we've actually seen that people who have basic income work more, not less. I'll just repeat that just in case those conservative MPs can't hear me. They work more, not less. The second argument, which I find genuinely objectionable, is that none of those MPs stand up and say they want to abolish inherited wealth. If you think about inherited wealth, that's a lot of something for nothing, which a minority receive generation after generation. The biggest landowner in the country is the Earl of Buccleuch. He inherited 277,000 acres of prime land because he happens to be the 10th descendant of an illegitimate child of Charles II. In addition, he gets millions of pounds from the government in subsidies for which he does not have to do any work. He gets it. He may do some work, but he gets it because it's a subsidy to encourage him to be able to do the work. Ian Duncan Smith inherited through his wife 1,500 acres of prime land, and he too has received hundreds of thousands, actually several million, in subsidies for which he has not had to do any work. He does work. He works a lot, which proves that if you have a basic income, it doesn't stop you working. Now, for me, this is hypocrisy, because basically what you're saying, it's a class-based prejudice. It's all very well for the rich to have a basic income guaranteed big time. But for the ordinary man and woman, no way. For me, this is prejudice. It's class-based prejudice. It's hypocrisy.
It's incredibly...
We know experiments that actually work and leisure improve in quality. Stress is reduced. What's wrong with that? I don't know it.
It's certainly true that, well, Bertrand Russell said something similar in his essay in Praise of Idleness. You know, the people in power, so to speak, preach the value of the dignity of labour for other people while taking great cares to remain undignified themselves in that respect, or something along those lines.
Actually, William Morris said it as well. William Morris.
Yeah, but I mean, there's nothing necessarily wrong with. I mean, William Morris himself was he had a private income, I think, from tin mines and things like that. But he did very good things with it. Again, that demonstrates, as you say, if you have a private income, you don't just sit around doing nothing. Another thing that demonstrates that, I think, is the furlough scheme. We've seen governments were quite worried that, given money to stay at home, that people would sort of, I don't know, do nothing. And also, or not like it. But under furlough, people did actually write poetry, do gardening, and look after themselves, and find the time to actually nurture their own bodies and spirits and minds. What do you see under furlough? Do you think that proves anything, or is it a sort of silly comparison with basic income?
I'm glad you've raised it, because I wrote an article in the Financial Times saying this, I believe, is the most regressive social policy I have ever witnessed, and that it would be subject to enormous fraud and enormous deadweight, and that never before has a government paid people on condition that they don't work. The Tories, who claim that they want people to work, have suddenly voted for a policy that actually says you can't work, you'll get money, but you can't work. It's a remarkable policy. And I wrote another piece. I never thought I would be invited to write a piece in the Daily Telegraph. It's not been my paper of choice, but they wrote to me and asked me, would you please write a piece in the Telegraph, your critique of the furlough scheme? And the interesting thing, and the article begins by mentioning that, is that the latest statistics are showing that 1 in 3 of the people on furlough who are being paid not to work have actually been working. So they've got the money and they've been doing the work in the job. Now, 1 in 3 comes to 3 million people. That's a big fraud. It's a big fraud. For me, the worst aspect of the furlough scheme is that it's incredibly regressive. The average or higher income earner will get £2,000 a month. Someone in the Precariat, the group that I've written most about, someone in the Precariat will get £300 or £400 a month. Now that is regressive to the extreme. Someone who's unemployed or suddenly down on their uppers will get an extra £20 per week, £80 altogether. If you look at that, that is a class-based regressive policy that I've never imagined possible, that any government would be able to introduce it without being savaged by the opposition. And yet the opposition has tamely gone along and supported it. I don't understand the rationale for the Labour leadership to be so quiescent about it, because it's clearly regressive. It's clearly encouraging inefficiency. It's clearly contributing to the collapse of output. And basically it's a scheme that could have been the money could have been used in a far better way to give resilience to everybody. That money, which is going to come, the amount of money they spend by the end of it will be 200 billion. If they'd use that money to give everybody a basic income, the resilience of our society would have been increased. People could have recovered by having more money in their pockets to buy basic goods and services. And they could have adapted in their own way with a sense of security. At the moment, we have millions of people who are going to be using food banks, who are going to be in desperate, something worse than idleness. They'll be undignified hanging around. That's not idleness in the sense we mean it. So for me, I think it's a terrible scheme.
Now, Guy, we'll go to Mark Vernon in a minute. But can you just sort of finish off by saying what needs to happen now, and what would be the cost of implementing a basic income scheme? You know, roughly, you must have looked into some sort of figures. If the furlough scheme, which, as you say, you know, benefited a few people, and was a little bit like a basic income on first view, because people got an income and they didn't have to work, but it was full of flaws, as you just explained. Cost 200 billion. How much would it cost for a year, you know, to give everyone a sort of reasonable basic income in the UK?
Well, I think there has I've answered this in different ways in the books, both of those books that you've mentioned. And what I proposed is that we need to move in three ways. First of all, I've advocated operating pilots in various places where local councils have actually voted in favor of having a pilot basic income scheme. And that would merely be a replacement of the universal credit or the legacy benefits, depending what's operational in those places. So what you would do is you could give everybody, say, I'm not proposing this as a desirable policy, but as a starter, if you gave everybody £100 and you converted the personal income tax and allowance, and you just converted the existing benefits, and you had special extra benefits for people with disabilities and frailties, you've got to have separate, because what you're aiming at is to give everybody equal basic income security. So people who have more needs because extra costs of living should have more, obviously. Now, if you did that, you could easily afford it without raising income tax. And you could do it by rolling back some of the incredible range of tax reliefs and subsidies that the likes of Ian Duncan Smith receive. £150,000 a year he receives, I think is the amount. And you roll those back. Treasury calculates that tax reliefs come to about £430 billion a year. In other words, foregone revenue by the Treasury. You should roll those back. Many of them have no justification. They don't increase output. They don't increase efficiency. They're special interest stuff. You could easily afford it, but that is not my long-term vision for paying. Long-term vision for paying is in the book Plunder of the Commons. What I propose in that book, in chapter 8, is I say, look, those people and companies and interests that have taken our commons, which doesn't belong to them legitimately, and have made big profits from taking our commons, should compensate the commoners by paying levies which would go into a commons capital fund that would be like the Norwegian pension fund, as it would rise, you could pay out social dividends, which would form a basic income. And if you take something like a wealth tax, we undertax wealth. We need to tax wealth. If we just had a 1% tax on wealth, we would go a long way to paying a decent basic income. We also need a carbon tax. We need eco-taxes, big time. Otherwise, we're going to rush and continue to rush towards extinction and global warming. But we can only introduce carbon taxes if you take account that by themselves, they tend to be regressive. They tend to increase inequality. Therefore, you have to recycle the revenue raised by those taxes in the form of a flat rate basic income payment, which would go towards the kitty, if you like, the capital fund that you pay out. Now, in addition, of course, pollution is mainly caused by the rich, and the adverse consequences of pollution is borne by the poor. So in a sense, there is a moral case for having that levy, those eco-taxes. And I think that the justification must go back to the commons. Our wealth is far more to do with all the work and achievements and efforts of the generations before us than anything we do ourselves. And if you allow for that private inheritance, you should allow for social inheritance in the form of social dividends. It's common justice. And it would increase freedom for the poor. And it would give basic security, which gives the resilience which we need in the face of future pandemics and second waves of this pandemic. Because if some groups are left unresilient, then we're all going to be unresilient. And that lesson has not been learned yet by the politicians.
Well, thanks, Scott. That seems to make an incredible amount of sense to me. You know, if people aren't poor and have a sort of basic level of resilience, then they're going to be stronger to resist all kinds of things, which means, you know, resisting exploitation by bosses, resisting diseases, or whatever it might be. Now, Guy, we're going to come back in a sec when Victoria's gathered together a few questions from idler readers in the audience.
Yeah.
I can have my drink.
And you can have your drink.
We've got lots.
Now, what are you drinking, Guy, there? Looks good.
It's the local white wine from the village, and I like to help. And we make our own olive oil, and it's very good wine. I recommend it, and it's dirt cheap. It costs €4 a bottle. So cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers, everybody.
Much better than Coca-Cola.
We've got a lot of questions to get through, Guy and Tom. So I'm going to crack on and ask people. And I'm sorry, everybody, if I don't get to call you out. There's a first question from Alex Pigott. Could you unmute, Alex, and ask your question?
All right. Thanks very much.
Hi.
Just with regards, Guy, with regards to the cost and how to pay for universal basic income, we've done a lot of work in Ireland on this. And in Ireland, after paying out €200 a week on the model we've put together, there is a net cost to the exchequer of about 5 billion. And we're looking at using land value tax in order to fund that. Is that what you were getting at in your book, Plunder the Commons?
Shall I answer Victoria?
Yes, please, Guy. Go.
Yeah, I've proposed that a land value tax be introduced in Britain, and you would raise quite a lot of money from a land value tax. I think you have to avoid the charge that the political right throw at it. This would be a garden tax. Because if you do that, then it becomes unpopular. So basically, you're going to have an increasing percentage rate. But you can raise a lot of money from a land value tax, and it has the virtue of being very hard to evade. Income tax and consumption taxes, particularly income tax, are increasingly evaded by the wealthy. They preach responsibility by others, but they use tax havens a great deal. Like the Chancellor worked out of a tax haven for years, made a lot of money there. But in fact, you can't escape a land value tax, because you can say, well, any resident, anybody who owns that land has to pay it. I mean, I think it's ridiculous that the government has given, I think it's about £1 million to Donald Trump during this lockdown from tax relief on his golf course land. For me, there's nonsensical things being done at the moment. The land value tax is very simple to understand. You don't have to be Henry George or Tom Paine. You get it. And I think it's a valuable instrument.
Thanks, Guy. And Lawrence Kelvin, you've got a question too. Could you unmute and ask it, Lawrence? You there. And Andrew Mailing, if you are there before Lawrence. You got Lawrence there? Brilliant. And Andrew Mailing, line yourself up.
I want to ask, first of all, what is the difference between basic income and helicopter money? And secondly, wouldn't a massive injection of money into the economy cause great inflation?
Thanks, Guy.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't like the term helicopter money, because that sounds as if it's just being thrown away and thrown out of the helicopter. If you imagine a whole lot of banknotes being thrown out of a helicopter into a field below, it would be the strongest and fittest who had managed to pick up all the money, whereas the people with disabilities and women and children would not get much of it. So I don't like the concept of it. I think that we have a situation where governments print money, banks print money, and we use that as a currency of exchange. And it's been used for speculative purposes. And in my book, The Corruption of Capitalism, I've shown how money makes money through bundling up debts. Debts become an asset, and the banks and the financiers make billions out of people's debts. For me, this is a matter of saying, look, this is a dividend on our wealth. And it's a way of saying, look, if you take our commons, our water, our air, our social commons, you make profits out of privatized being given it as an asset, you should compensate the commoners, you, me included, through this capital fund. And I think that that is the principle, which is different from the idea of helicopter money. The idea, the imagery is misleading. But you're absolutely right in saying that that's what is often talked about. Well, you can print money as a way of injecting demand, which is what we need. And I think it's just an inefficient way of doing it. And they did that after 2007, 2008. It was called quantitative easing. And quantitative easing led to huge returns to the financiers. Billionaires made billions, and the financial elite made huge amounts. It increased inequality, it increased the fragility, it increased private debt to the point where we have private debt today higher than any time in our history, where millions of people are living on the edge of one mistake, one illness, one accident, and they're out in the street. And this causes stress, it causes cardiac problems, it causes cancers, it causes demands on our health service. And the basic income is different. It's giving people a right. You have a right to basic security. And that right reduces stress. It reduces morbidity. We've seen that in the results. I've summarized experiments that have been done all over the place. It's very strong evidence. And it's unfair to expect people who are chronically insecure to make rational decisions that you and I might regard as easy to make. Because the psychologists have shown that if you're insecure, you lose your mental capacities. Therefore, it's morally repugnant to expect people who are in those circumstances to be making rational, ideal decisions. It's not fair. So I think it's a matter of fairness. I don't like the helicopter concept, but I think it's a good question.
But the second question was, how will you deal with the question of inflation? Because very soon,
yes, beg your pardon. Well, we've done experiments where we've provided thousands of people with basic income, and we've compared what happens with those people with equal numbers of people in similar communities. And the interesting thing is that after 2 years, prices had gone down in the area where the basic income was operational. And the reason was this. I'm an economist, and you've got to think about a pair of scissors. A pair of scissors, you say, well, if you increase money supply, then that increases demand. If you increase demand, that increases supply. Now, if somebody can anticipate making a decent profit, they will tend to invest, they will tend to expand. And with economies of scale, the prices, unit prices tend to go down, even though their income goes up. It all depends on the elasticity of supply. And the good thing about basic income is that you're tilting the demand away from the wealthy who spend on luxury goods and imports and so on, to predominantly anyhow, to people who are spending on local goods and services, which tend to be highly elastic in supply. And those things lead to an increase in production, an increase in the supply. And while the profits may go up, the unit prices go down. So for me, it's a matter of remembering the two sides of a pair of scissors. And I summarize the evidence in basic income and how we can let it happen. There's a chapter on it, which shows that around the world, when you do this sort of thing, it's not inflationary. But I think it's also a good question. Apologies, I didn't mean to forget it. I just got carried away with the other one.
Guy, we've had a lot of questions from people saying, what about the fact that the big tech companies are very keen on basic income? Really, we think because or suggested that they know that means that the government will be paying us to buy their products. So they'll have automatic access to government money.
Well, I could give you a long answer or a short answer. I better give a short answer. I apologize for taking up a lot of time. Other questions. I've been invited to Silicon Valley and, as you mentioned earlier, to Davos for 3 years to talk to those people. And I was invited across to San Francisco and to Singularity University and so on. So I met quite a few of these people. I never expected that to happen to someone like me. And it was very interesting because their perspective, and to be fair to people like them, is they know that they've been winning too much. It's from rentier capitalism. They've got multi-billions. They whatever happens to the politics, they'll make more billions. And for them, it's an intellectual issue. It's not a personal issue. But to be fair, the more intelligent and decent of those recognize that with the technologies, with the automation that's coming, they believe that there will be displacement of people from being employed. I argue that, in fact, I think there's going to be more than enough work for us to do for ad infinitum. I don't believe we're all going to be made idle in that way. But I do think that the automation is increasing the inequalities dramatically because it's increasing the rentier incomes those tycoons and their plutocratic corporations are making. And their arguments tend to be oriented to the technology side, but that doesn't mean that they're ogres in terms of recognizing that people need to be able to survive and live good lives. And I think it's wrong of us to presume that because we don't like the outcomes and some of the values that they have, that argument is all wrong. I think we have a primary responsibility, politically and as economists and as citizens, to see that the system of rentier capitalism, where more and more of the income is going to the owners of property, is dismantled, and we have a new income distribution system in which people would have a basic income guaranteed, paid from the commons, as I was saying, paid from the automation that's taking place, and that we can then work out how other people gain other parts of the income. We must realize that wealth in Britain has gone from being about 300% of GDP to over 700% today, and that over 60% of wealth is inherited. That's the crisis. And that has to be the point where we address. Those tycoons in the Silicon Valley are watching how more and more of that income is going in their direction. But I found that they admit it quite openly, quite a lot of them, and they say it's quite wrong. We understand it's quite wrong, but I'm on a football pitch, I'm on a football pitch, I play according to the rules.
So we need to regulate them. Thanks, Guy. And just probably two more questions if we've got a minute or two. Melissa, are you there? Could you ask your question quickly?
Yeah, I think you kind of already answered the question in something you were saying, really. But my concern would be about people who have, say, addiction problems or mental health problems, people who are vulnerable in our society, and that they were made to feel responsible for their own futures and their own livings because of this, and it would be an excuse for the wider society to duck out of their responsibility to those people over and above the basic payment. Do you know what I mean? That if people were very, very bad with money for whatever reason, how would people, society, governments use that as an excuse to say, oh, well, you know, we've given you the money, it's up to you if you want to waste it, there's nothing else for you in the pot. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, I get that question, a variant of that question a lot, and it's a perfectly respectable question. One way of looking at it is to say you can't win a game of golf with only one club. You can't say that a basic income is a panacea going to solve all our social problems. Of course not. It's merely one vital ingredient. It's necessary but not sufficient. And I believe things like you've just been talking about have to be addressed by experts, by people in the community, by family members who've got to have the capacities to be able to respond. And I hate the idea of state paternalism, using benefits as a way of disciplining and conducting punitive experiments on people. For me, that's odious. I think that we have to remember that moral freedom is important. And moral freedom means that we have to have, if we've got it, if we are lucky enough, if you mean, lucky enough to be able to make moral decisions. And you can't make moral decisions if the government is telling you what to do all the time. And you can't make moral decisions if you're chronically insecure and therefore you have to do whatever's necessary to survive. But I think the things you've been talking about require sensitivity, it requires dispassionate, compassionate attention, and much better policies and strategies than we've had in recent years, which seems to be treating the victims of society as if they must be reformed through punishment and surveillance and universal credit, which is a horrible set of mechanisms to try and discipline people, often irrationally and unfairly and arbitrarily, and it diminishes freedom. It diminishes the capacity of us as individuals and as society members to be idle in the proper sense, to be idle in the sense of developing ourselves, enjoying ourselves, writing that bad poetry, doing the art, looking at nature, enjoying the interaction, and our mental health and the things you're talking about react positively to those things. Many people are made ill by the circumstances in which they are forced to live. We know that. It's nothing profound about that. We know it. And yet policies by governments make it harder and harder for people who are fragile to have that resilience. And this pandemic is teaching us one big thing. We need resilience, the capacity to withstand shocks. And the resilience of every one of us in this conversation is going to be determined by the resilience of the weakest members of our society. And unless we give them basic security, we're all effed. Excuse me, I had a drink. But that's where we are today. And I think this discussion is so relevant to the response that we need from the pandemic. And I'm getting every single day, from all over the world at the moment, people contacting me asking, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And that, I think, is the great question. Because it may not appear idle, but we must be active, pressurize, for the ability for all of us to enjoy life and be more leisurely in the way we do it. And that will come through a change in our income distribution system, the realization that we should want for the other what we want for ourselves. And for me, that's simplicity that we're learning and relearning in this pandemic.
Thanks, Guy. Thank you. I think you tallied with Mark's thoughts there. Both of you came in together with equal wisdom from very different angles, philosophy and economy. That's been so enriching. And if you check down the chat, Guy, people are loving what you've been talking about. So thank you so very much.